Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a protocol specialist at stakefish. So I'll be talking about decentralization transparency on the ETH2 beacon chain. So I guess relative to other networks, it would be nice to have some transparency and insight into the state of what our decentralization is on Ethereum 2 beacon chain. So stakefish is a proof of stake validator, and we've been supporting Ethereum 2 deposits. So yeah, I'll be talking about a few things. So first, talking about how we can get from raw data to revealed data, going over some terminology, talking a little bit about transparency and understanding what that actually means. Some concepts of, I guess, security through obscurity, and if that is actually something that's necessary for the robustness and security of our networks. The tragedy of the open source commons and the bystander effect, and what that has to do with our decentralization transparency and whose responsibility ultimately it comes down to. And then I'll end with some sort of actionable insights. So yeah, I mean, we're very familiar with like the moniker, don't trust, verify. But I think what actually happens is we oftentimes have to trust in either infrastructure providers, applications, or even just popular figures that kind of say, hey, this is the way that things are, this is the state, and then we are no wiser if we don't have the technical acumen to verify it for ourselves. So I think an important part is, right, anyone can definitely run a node, but do many people actually run those nodes? Like, I would say very few of the people who are interacting with Ethereum today do. And so I think like that type of transparency in like these public networks should be publicly available and accessible to anyone. And that means that, right, there should be ways of being able to verify easily, right? And so like I say here, like vanity metrics aside, beyond that of like leaderboards for how much stake that you do control over the system, right, objective transparency into that is important for robust security, and also to kind of maintain like the open source principles of our network. So I'll go over some terminology, because I think there definitely is a bit of ambiguation between other proof of stake networks and that of Ethereum 2, specifically with regards to what a validator is and what a validator is not. And then what service providers are and independent setups. So this comes down to like naming conventions. I think like with other proof of stake networks, if you're not familiar, there are validators who are basically like the miners of proof of stake, so to speak, and they accept delegations on your behalf, and then you kind of get like a little reward from that, from helping participate in the security of the system. But I think and those delegation amounts on those different networks are uncapped, right? You can basically send as many tokens on those networks to a validator service provider. But on Ethereum, you technically are able to send like an infinite amount of tokens. But the way that validators are described is basically broken down into effectively 32 ETH increments, where a validator is determined by 32 ETH, right? And so it's somewhat capped. Also, there's kind of this concept of like what is what and who is who are custodians, non-custodial providers, custodial providers, centralized exchanges, independent setups, and then also, right, like certain I guess like white label agreements that happen between service providers and other service providers, and service providers and even non-custodial exchanges. And this is just like an example from, I think this guy's, Alex, was from like the Tezos ecosystem that does have like right, as I mentioned, the uncapped delegation amounts for which is attributed to a particular validator, and in this case, validator service providers. And he's basically saying here, right, Ethereum is showing there's like at this point in time in December 2nd, like 21,000 independent validators, but right, it's not actually 21,000 independent validators. It's 21,032 ETH denominated validators that may represent 21,000 people or just a few of those. And you kind of get into these umbrellas that you kind of portion them off into, where how many of those 21,000 are actually independent setups? How many of those are kind of denominated into validator service providers like us, stakefish? How many does stakefish actually control, right? Like the validation keys, the signing keys. Obviously, we are non-custodial and we don't hold your withdrawal keys. And then how many of those are custodial exchanges or just custodians like Bitcoin Suisse, for example. So I think that like that terminology disambiguation is important to kind of understand, right? Just like the pure raw numbers we see is not necessarily what is actually presented, right? And so, for example, I just broke it down here, right? This is one way to kind of look at it right now. We have individuals with independent setups. We have non-custodial service providers like stakefish. We have decentralized pools like Lido and Rocket Pool, and we have custodial exchanges like centralized exchanges, and then custodians like Bitcoin Suisse. And so within these buckets, I think we can kind of come to a start of where this what decentralization actually looks like. Sorry about that. And if we could bucket these instead of the 21,000 amount, I think right now we actually have 70,000, but right, how much of those are kind of bracketed into existing service provider umbrellas? How many of those are individuals? And obviously from that, we can kind of see kind of unique amounts of where the decentralization actually is and what state we're at. And that kind of leads into the concept of like transparency, right? Obviously, like the scalability trilemma is decentralization, security, and scalability, right? Right. And so, right, these are all important concepts. They're inherent to it. And then I think perhaps with the way that some people are familiar in terms of exposing their validators, let's say independent versus large service providers, it's sometimes misunderstood as kind of anti-security. And I'll talk about that concept in a bit. But I would say that basically, to sum it up, like transparency in favor over privacy is basically paramount to identifying the state of decentralization. The transparency that we can see at least gives us a clear picture of the state, and then from an understanding of a clear picture of the state, then we can kind of act on that and see what we can do from that. Right, and this is basically an issue of how many independents we have versus how many kind of pooled providers do we have. So this leads into the tragedy, I say, of like the open source commons, right? So and the bystander effect. So we can talk about, and as I mentioned, security through obscurity, where there are these security engineering principles that kind of have talked a little bit about this, right? Like Claude Shannon, the information theorist, kind of says like you should have a default state of like the enemy knows the system. Right? I think another popular one is like Kirchhoff's principle, where it says like a crypto system should be secure even if everything about the system except for the key is public knowledge. And then Ross Anderson says like the security of a system should depend on its key, not on its design remaining obscure. And I would say that these are pretty good arguments against having privacy at all costs to obscure your setups or even expose like how much of the system that you own, just for that type of privacy, right? Because I would say that maybe it makes sense for independents, but for large service providers, right? That's something that we as infrastructure providers should have been doing from the beginning as a default, right? And right, it's also having an understanding of like these open source systems that we should be under the assumption that the enemy always will gain full familiarity with them. I think like a good example that we've seen even like in the Witty testnet, like one of the consensus researchers, Johnny Rhea, like basically was able to almost trivially be able to to dox certain people, right? And he was able to show that, right? And so I would say that, right, this privacy that you obtain from security through obscurity is at the expense of decentralization transparency. And at the expense of decentralization transparency, you get issues with actually understanding the complete state of the system. And if you don't understand the complete state of the system, then you can't understand like what you may be able to do. Maybe you may have like an abstract or vague concept of, oh, right, a certain validator service provider has an enormous amount of control or influence over the current beacon chain network, and then we should do something about it, right? But we can't just operate on this under this kind of like fog of assuming things are going as well as where they're going, right? And so that's the kind of concept of like robustness. Yeah, oh, sorry, I must have redone that slide, but yeah. So the concept is, right, at the end of the day, who is responsible for these things, right? We're in like an open source environment. We're in public networks and public systems, but right, Peter Gutmann had given a talk on at KiwiCon in like 2007, where he was talking about like this design mentality of like bugs in the brain, right? Like and how these bugs and maybe applied to our decentralized networks is sort of like centralization is the bug, right? Everyone also assumes that someone else is looking at it, right? And in the end, like the burden of making sure that these things are operating as they should, that decentralization is being achieved as they should, it falls on like no one, and it also falls on everyone at the same time. And so because everyone is making these assumptions, we don't have clarity into the state, then no one's doing it, right? And so I'm not trying to like harp on anyone here, but like I think there are specific things that, right, we should be aware of, and then we should be kind of pushing to make sure we have transparency into. Right. And so I think Philip Monk, he's a developer, I think with the Urbit project, has like a fantastic quote that I love. It says, where sovereignty necessitates understanding. If you don't understand the system you're using, you don't control it. And if nobody understands the system is in control. And in this case, like, what does that mean, right? If you don't understand the state of decentralization transparency, or if you don't understand the state of decentralization and you don't have transparency into it and you're making assumptions, then the people who are actually benefiting from it, or let's say at risk or in power of being able to benefit from it, are perhaps large service providers like stakefish itself, right? And right, the community and the ecosystem should be aware and maybe should be more cognizant and demanding of their large service providers to kind of identify themselves, or at least have some pressure there, positive pressure, I would say. Right, and then again, right, you have like the "don't trust, verify" moniker. But the thing is that I think we realize is, like, what if we can't verify it, right? Most people can't verify it. And this type of decentralization transparency must be easy to verify and understandable. I know I have like 1 more minute left, but I think I will definitely say, like, there are initiatives that are in place that need to have these dashboards that are open source, independently hosted, especially not by validators or validator service providers like stakefish, right? So there's no conflict of interest. They need to be credibly neutral and be treated as public goods. And for example, these are some initiatives that are going on, right? Beacon Chain is developing some dashboards to support this. Nansen is as well. There's community initiatives that Elias from Bison Trails is doing. And then Superfish from the ETH2 due diligence committee is also spearheading a lot of this coordination as well. So please, I mean, like, go contact them, and then that would be some great ways to kind of get started and contribute. But yeah, I mean, there's public and private interest in here. I think we're all in the same boat towards kind of developing Ethereum 2 and getting to that point. Yeah, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.